All right, brothers, we've been giving attention to poetry. It's a very important genre in the Bible. I think something like, I can't remember, over 20% of the Bible is poetic, uses poetry, maybe even a little more than that. So, we have narrative is the most common. More than half the Bible is narrative form. But the next type of genre in the Bible is poetry. Uh, it's more common than epistles. And so even more common than prophecy because many of the prophetic books are actually poetic. So uh, poetry and narrative are actually very important. And, we have the epistles, and that's a critical part of scripture, direct instruction to the church, how to applying the cross to uh, life situations. And, so the epistles obviously are very key writings for us in the Bible. But we have to remember, in terms of the style of writing, it's a very small portion. Um, most of the Bible is narrative and poetic. Uh, so now all the Bible, of course, is instructive, and all of the Bible is, as Paul said, is profitable, is for teaching, for correction, training in righteousness, so the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. So every part of the Bible is important. It's all God breathed. But the way in which God breathed it out in terms of the style, the genre, the kind of writing, we have the narrative is the majority, and then poetic writing. Both of those really feed the prophetic books. Prophetic books are essentially made up of combination of the of narrative, poetry, and direct instruction, right, through sermons. So it combines all of these, and so that's why we want to first. We're studying each part. We looked at epistles back in the module one. Then module two, we were looking at narratives, and then now looking at poetry. So poetry's also a direct form of instruction, similar to epistles and sermons, but the manner, the fashion, way that it presents that direct instruction, of course, is a little different. There's imagery and figurative language. There's particular kinds of structure. We looked at parallelism. So these are some features in poetry that are important to consider. So that's why I've spent quite a bit of time just sort of going through the poetic analysis and looking at we talked about parallelism and figures of speech and structure, the stanzas. We looked at acrostics, things like that. And then the last several sessions, we've been applying all of that to an example from Psalm 128. So tonight, my hope is that we can sort of finish that example and complete the poetic analysis for that, just to um, see how far we can get on that. But we have looked at in the poetic analysis of the poem, which includes these steps: to read and observe the poem, to identify the setting and the structure of the poem, look at the parallelism used in the poem, and then now we're going to focus our attention on the imagery and the poetic devices that we excuse me, that we see in the poem. All right, so we're going to use Psalm 128 as our example, and I'm going to ask if Chun Si, if you wouldn't mind reading this for us, just by way of reminder. And as Chun Si reads, um, look for any images, any pictures that are painted or described by the author. All right.
The 6 verses.
Yeah, all six verses here.
Okay. How blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. When you shall eat of the fruit of your hands, you will be happy and it will be well with you. Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine within your house, your children like olive plants around your table. Behold, for thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you from Zion, and may you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Indeed, may you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel.
Great, thank you. All right, so like I said, we've done these these earlier steps already, excuse me, in our previous sessions. Looked at this poem, and a couple of things we noticed. In fact, if you see here, when the last couple of sessions we were looking at the structure of the poem. Again, if we notice there that inclusio that I underlined, we identified really two stanzas in this particular poem. We first noticed it's a song of ascents, and so it was, of course, that gives us the occasion for the psalm. Who remembers the songs of ascents? What were those psalms written for? What does that title tell us about this psalm?
It's a series of psalms that starts in Psalm 120, and then it goes on to about Psalm 134, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
And it's one of those psalms that is called a Halal that the Jewish pilgrims will sing as they journey up or journey back to Jerusalem and then journey up to the temple for the 3 annual feasts.
Yes. Yeah, Booth, Pentecost, and always go blank on the third one. Third annual feast.
Wait. The Booth?
Yeah, Feast of Booths and the Pentecost.
Passover.
Passover. Yeah, duh. Okay. Right. So the songs of ascents were intended, as they were, as the author wrote them. The author wrote it with the intention that they be sung during these 3 annual feasts, particularly on the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and especially going up into the temple area. So their focus is on Israel, on Jerusalem, on Mount Zion, on families. We see a definite themes around that. Also, too, as we observe this particular psalm, it is a song of ascent. And as we look at it, we see that it's also a wisdom psalm. That is a psalm that is intended to be instruction. This doesn't fall under the category of a praise psalm or a lament or a royal psalm, but really it's an instructive psalm. Notice that whenever you see how blessed, it's kind of telling you, look, this is the blessed man. This is the blessed person. This is what we want to pursue. We want to be. So it's more of an instructive idea. If you think about it, Psalm 1 is another example of that. Right? How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of wicked. So it's really intended to be instructive for us. All right. And so as we consider that this is an instructive, a wisdom psalm, and there's a few of these. Actually, the psalm right before it, Psalm 127, is also a wisdom psalm written by Solomon. And here it doesn't have how blessed in it, but it does describe, it gives instruction to, well, no, it does. I forgot about that. Verse 5, how blessed is the man whose quiver is full with them. He's talking about children. So, but this is also an instructive or a wisdom psalm. That's intent is to provide a instruction regarding some aspect of life. And so here we see that element, that it's a wisdom psalm, a song of ascent, and then also the structure we've discussed as well, where we see this inclusio that tells us these verses 1 to 4 really are one unit of thought, focusing attention on who is blessed. All right. And so in this case, the focus was on the blessed man and his work, his labor, and his home. And then we see a shift in the last two verses, focusing attention on more in general, on Zion, Jerusalem, on Israel, and just so there is a change in topic, but also we noted before, notice that may you see, and really the first line could be may the Lord bless you. All of these indicate it's more of like a prayer. These last two verses 1 to 4, there's just a focus on who is the blessed man. It's instructive, but the last two verses there's also that change in the tone where it's more of like a prayer. So all of those factors, I think, clearly show this poem has two stanzas, two units of thought being presented. And so then we looked at before the parallelism within each verse as we sort of examine the poem more carefully. Now we want to turn our attention to the imagery and the poetic devices used. Again, that's the next step here in our poetic analysis, really the last one before we then summarize the each of the stanzas in the poem. All right, so we want to spend our time this evening taking a look at the imagery. So with that, let me do this. Let's identify what images do you see in the poem. That is, again, remember, poetry, for Hebrew poetry, one of the primary elements is imagery. That's a key feature in Hebrew poetry, is describing pictures so that we now, as we're reading, we see things in our mind. We gain an idea of it's like a painting that he's painting for us. And so it's helpful to see what are the images being portrayed in the poem, and what would those images, how would the original audience understand that image? How would the original audience be impacted by that image? And so that's really the three pieces here we want to consider is what is the image that we see here? How would the original audience understand that image? And really, how would the original audience be impacted or affected by that image? All right? Because again, we have to remember that this, the scripture was written to an original audience, and it's what the original author intended for them to understand. That's a priority. It's not what we think the image is, not what we think the image, how it affects us. All right. Initially, we want to first understand what is the impact on the original hearers or the original readers. Okay. And I think this should be obvious to us. If we are to write something to a particular person at a particular time and a place and for a particular reason, then what's most important in understanding the meaning is, what do we know about the author and the audience, and how would that writing, how would the original audience have understood that writing? It's the same with these images. I think a lot of times we get in trouble in the Bible, especially in poetic passages, where we assume from our experience and our background, we assume the meaning of an image and how it would be understood today. And even the same image today in different cultures may have a different effect or a different impact on the original the hearers, right? There are certain images, perhaps in the US, certain ways you might describe something that in Malaysia or Singapore or Pakistan or any other country may have a very different effect, a different idea. So we have to be careful that we don't take how we would perceive an image, how we are affected by an image, and then assume that's what the author was communicating. It's possible. There are some images that are universal, a nursing mother, like when Paul describes in First Thessalonians, his care for them is like a nursing mother. That's a pretty universal image that has the same effect in any culture at any time. So there are some images that will have a very similar impact on us today as they would have in the original time of writing. But don't assume that. We start with, okay, what do we understand that culture? How would they have received that image? How would they have been affected by the image? How would they have understood that image? That's where we need to start from. Okay. So with that, though, let's identify what images do we see here in this particular poem. All right. Anybody want to?
Oh, we have the image in verse 2 of the fruit of your hands.
Okay. So let me do this. So we have the fruit. Let's see, verse 2. The fruit of your hands. And what about the fruit of your hands? What is the image being presented there?
You will enjoy, you will eat, you will harvest.
All right, good. And so here, the fruit of your hands, I think it's also, that's the more literal interpretation, or translation. It's the labor of your hands. So it seems to be focused on the image of, it's an agricultural.
Yes.
Harvesting the crops. And that would make sense, right? The primary type of labor in the culture of that time was agrarian, right? Was agriculture. You had, yes, some carpenters, some those who built homes and things like that, but the primary job or labor in those times was to grow crops of food. And so here, I think that's the image being given in verse 2 is this man, this person being blessed with his labor and even eat the fruit of your hands, right? To receive the blessing of the labor and using an agricultural image. I remember, I think I've mentioned to you guys before, I grew up with my grandparents for my early life, and they grew crops. So, they had watermelon and tomatoes and corn, these kinds of things. And I remember as a boy often going with my grandfather into the crops, and we would grab a watermelon and we would eat it. That would be our meal for the day. We would eat this huge watermelon with some salt. This is a common practice here. I'm sure Dwayne's probably done it. And we just cut up the watermelon, and my grandfather and I would just sit and eat the whole watermelon. So it's kind of that and I think that's the idea here, is that the satisfaction of that work that we put into those crops and then enjoying that production. We also, with the corn, we'd make this sweet corn. It's like sugar. you know, it was so good. But there's that satisfaction and enjoyment of receiving the blessing of your labors, your effort there. So I think this image would have a similar effect today, and those, especially those who would grow up farming. But any other thoughts about that? This particular image, how would it have affected, impacted the original audience, you think?
I'm thinking, Pastor Tim, sorry, that if you look at the images in Psalm 128, we have the fruit of the labor of your hands. We have the wife, who is like a fruitful vine, and we have the children described like olive shoots or olive plants around the table. Certainly, the two images of the labor of your hands, the fruit of your hand, and the even the fruitful vine, but of course describing the wife, and the olive shoots are basically agricultural images. And I was just thinking, how would it impact the original audience, or how would they think? I was thinking of a couple of scriptures in the Old Testament. One is the Deuteronomy 28, where the Mosaic law talks about a series of blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. In a series of blessings for obedience, the Lord says that you'll be blessed in three ways, two times. You'll be the fruit of the womb will be blessed, the crops of your land will be blessed, and the young of your livestock will be blessed. So I think, and the Lord says it in Deuteronomy 28, verse 4, and then again in verse 11, similar three dimensions of blessings or prosperity in terms of the fruit of the womb, the young of your livestock, and the crops of your ground. And I think a Jewish worshipper, as he journeyed up to Jerusalem, to the temple, he will call to his mind as he sings this song of ascent, what God has pronounced through the Mosaic covenant. And being a Jew, and in the agricultural sense, I think, I'm just my guess here, they know very well the blessings of their crops and so on are so dependent on the Lord being pleased with them. It is not an accident that the rain, whether come in the right time. That's how in the Old Testament we got the latter day rain and the former rain. That the correct timing when the rain will come and so on and so forth, the soil conditions, the sun, are all the doing of Yahweh. So in that sense, it is very, what comes to their mind as they travel to worship is that the Lord is pleased with them, and therefore the Lord is blessing them. Sorry, I've been speaking too much.
No, that's good. I think, yeah, we definitely see, I think it's a good observation. Notice that really in verses 2 and 3, we have three particular images, but they're all sort of around the same kind of theme, agricultural. And yes, conveying the idea of God's blessing on the crops. And again, well, it should, because how is it introduced? How blessed is everyone who fears the Lord? Thus shall the man be blessed. And so, yeah, definitely in that culture, and in thinking about the Deuteronomy 28 in particular, also Leviticus 26, where God indicated, in fact, I'll put that in here, right? That one of the blessings of obedience, of faithfulness to the covenant would be the crops.
Yeah.
And so that would definitely sort of connect to the idea of the importance of being their covenant faithfulness of that's just in that culture, right? The primary evidence of God's blessing and care is the crops. And conversely, what did God promise would be the result if they were unfaithful to the covenant? What would happen to their crops?
Or it's the leanness in the land that we hardly any harvest. I mean, like Habakkuk says, though the tree, the fig tree does not fruit, that kind of pathetic harvest.
Yeah, even what comes to my mind, yeah, Habakkuk, right? The fruit of the vine they wouldn't have, and even Joel. You remember the locust plague.
Locusts, devoured.
And Joel, that was a consequence of their unfaithfulness to the covenant, that their crops were destroyed. So we really see a close connection between, under the Mosaic covenant, between faithfulness to that covenant and either the blessing or the curse on the crops. That was a direct, that there would be rain or no rain, right? The famine, drought would come with unfaithfulness, whereas God's provision through the land would come with faithfulness. So yeah, I think definitely you're thinking like a ancient Near Eastern Hebrew, Yuchai. That's definitely I think the important connection that we need to make sure we see there. And
so I think, shall I wear this?
There you go. Yeah. Where's your yarmulke? Even, because today we could understand that idea a little bit, but I think if you lived on a farm, grew up on a farm, and experienced, times of good crops or times of bad, you would have a greater appreciation for what he's saying here in this text. So,
Pastor Tim,
yeah,
just a question about some culture. You're saying that you grew up, experiencing all this farm life, but how about the young people now in this US? Do they have such a privilege to experience it? Not at all.
More people live in the cities now, so yeah, they just go to the grocery store or the restaurant, and that's how they understand. Some of them don't even. I think Dwayne could probably speak to this, but yeah, there's much fewer now have that experience growing up on the farm. So we can understand it in a sense, right? Even if we don't grow up on a farm, we can understand the idea. But I think again, remember, in poetry, it's that emotional impact that the poetry can bring. And so the better we understand the image, and even if we've experienced it, I think that the better we will appreciate what the author is wanting to communicate, what he's wanting to emphasize. So we need to do our best to sort of try to step into the world of the author. This is true in any book, right? We talked about this with epistles. We're trying to step into the world of the author and the recipients to best understand what he's saying. It's no different with this. Is we do our best to step into the world. Well, how do we do that? Well, let me pose that question to you. How do we sort of, let's say you grew up in the city, so you've never experienced this. We don't live in those times of when this poem was written or where it was written. So how do we step into their world, so to speak? What would be a way to, we can't go back, we don't have a time machine. So we can't get in a time machine and travel to Israel, back in 1000 BC or 900 BC, whenever this was written. So what do we do?
I was just thinking, Pastor Tim, that it is actually, to me, I said it quite a while ago, that it's difficult for us as today because you see in the ancient or even in today's in a farming agricultural setting or someone who is involved, the person knows very well the dependence on the Lord, and the need for the Lord to actually to be giving him the sustenance, because if the rain comes in the wrong time or whatever, it's disasters. And in a modern world, because most of us go to work and we don't see that direct connections, of the plant growing, it's not eaten by the locusts. And in fact, I planted some passion fruit for about 2 months now and waiting, nothing happened. Every day I go and watch, is there anything happening or not? Stuff like that. And so that take us away, or we are very remote from that direct dependence on the Lord as our provider and sustainer. And it becomes dependent on the money or the work, because end of the month or end every 2 weeks you get a salary by working. So that direct dependence on the Lord, it's not so immediate to us in our mind and our heart. I have a business friend, actually. He's a backslided Christian, and he's about 40 something. He quit his corporate job, and I helped him quite a bit actually. And then eventually he quit the marketing job and worked business as well. And then he went into farming in a big way in Malaysia, very big way. He has like 200 acres in the northeast of Peninsula, and another 150 or so in Seremban, not too far from Dwayne. And he's been doing this for about 4 years with his friends, working very hard. Every day drive into the farms and so on. And he was just telling me last year, and then again early this year, they plant papaya, they plant long beans and so on. It is so difficult that in one occasions, the insects come and wipe off half of the plantations and the orchards. And another occasions, they planted some, I think, papaya or something, and it wasn't like fruiting well. And it's kind of very catch-22. Do I still wait for 3 months, hoping that the harvest will be good? Or do I throw away the current batch now and replant again? And here I am, I'm 6 months behind. And he has burned all his savings and money for the last 20 years of working. And he was desperately looking for money everywhere. So I think in a normal factory work or office work, we are very remote from that sense of dependence on the Lord.
Yeah, that's true. And I think this is what is important about trying to understand the impact of the image on the original audience, how they would understand it and be affected. Because then if you're teaching this passage, when you're teaching poetry, you want to try to help your hearers understand in the same way. So you may need to use an example from your experience and your culture that your hearers would understand. So yeah, if you live in the city, you don't do farming. What are some other things that would show, the dependence on the Lord and the blessing that would affect them in a similar way as this poem would have affected the original audience? So that's going to come in when you preach the passage, when you teach the passage. You want to consider that. There's sort of 2 stages. The first stage now is we're just trying to understand what this image is, and how what is the intent or meaning of the image for the original audience, and how would it have impacted them? We have to start there. And then later, when we want to teach this particular poem, it's then, okay, how can I translate that image and its impact on my hearers? Okay, so if I'm teaching this in the Midwest of the United States, where there's a lot of farming, I may not have to do much to translate it, because they would understand it more. But if I'm speaking to someone who just grew up in the city, or as you mentioned, question, the younger generation, or those, then I'm going to have to consider maybe another kind of image that would communicate the same idea. So that's the teaching side of it. On right now we're on the study side of it, so we're just trying to understand. And so my question is, how do we gain that understanding? How would we figure out what that image meant to the original audience? How it would have affected them? So you described sort of you went back Deuteronomy 28 and sort of this connection between being blessed with crops as we're faithful to the Lord. And we see that element here, even how blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. And that some of the blessing from that will be enjoying the labors. Then it describes the wife as a fruitful vine, children as olive plants. So how are we to understand what is that image, those three images, how would we identify what the original audience would have understood and thought about those images? How do we do that?
One way is to look up maybe a concordance or a word search. Even like I do quite a bit word search using the Bible Gateway of how those imagery or the idea is used. For example, where did the Old Testament, especially, or even sometimes in the New Testament, use the imagery of the vine? Yeah. Jesus used it in John 15, but we don't touch New Testament. Let's go back to Old Testament. Yeah. Right? Isaiah chapter 5, for example. The Lord said, I've done so much for Israel. Why is it that I look for a fruitful vine, but I only get bad fruit? The idea, we can make that. I think there's another one in Jeremiah 11, 16 to 17 as well. So we look at the Old Testament, a word search, vine, olive plant, fruit of your hands, and see how the Old Testament used those phrases, and hopefully it helps us to enter into the world of the Old Testament readers or audience.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Oh, you got a whole lot of them. Oh, yeah. Wow.
We've got to go to the Bible, and see what does the Bible tell us. Sometimes, like a Bible resource, like a Bible encyclopedia can be helpful. But first we want to, I think, go to a concordance and just look up, okay, fruitful vine, olive plants, what was the significance of those in that culture? Why would the author have chosen, he compares the wife to a fruitful vine. What is he trying to say with that image? He compares the children, that the blessing of God through children would be that they're like olive shoots, olive plants around the table. So we want to, I just went ahead and did that because I think particularly, so one image, the fruitful vine of the wife.
A whole host of them. Yeah. Wow.
Okay. So there's plenty of references in the Old Testament to vine. And I think one of the assumptions, and I've seen this when this passage is preached, is this idea of it's just referring to children. All right, that like a vine, and this would be thinking more in modern sense, like, a vine produces grapes. So the grapes are like the children. So a fruitful vine means that the wife's having lots of children. And then I've seen this passage used, and it pressures women, especially, like, if you don't have children, you're not blessed.
Yeah.
Right? And is that could be the primary focus here and meaning of this image, but it may not be. We don't know until we go and look, okay, how is a fruitful vine described in the Old Testament? Is it just regarding children, having children? All right, so we want to be careful, Because if we don't understand this rightly, we could really discourage those in our congregations. So we want to make sure we're careful. Is that the idea of the vine? So I just looked up fruitful vine and the different references to it. References before and even after this psalm was written. There's a few passages in the prophets, but still, I think it would speak to the idea of the vine. So notice several characteristics. A vine provided sustenance. It provided food, right? Sweet smelling in the Song of Solomon. The vine is the primary characteristic expressed there was that it's sweet smelling. The beauty of the vine. There is a beauty in the vineyards. If you've seen vineyards that are fruitful, this the green leaves and the bright fruit, it's very pretty. The vine's described as a place of protection and shade in 1 Kings, place of rest and comfort in Zechariah, a sign of blessing, as we see here, a sign of fertile soil and rich land in Deuteronomy, a source of enjoyment through the wine produced by the vine, enjoyable, as we see in Psalms, productive, thriving, healthy. So I think if we look at all of these, we see it's much more than just whether or not she produces children. And I would argue that may not even be a primary meaning here. All right. In that culture, and then notice these scriptures, and there's many of them, it's more of this picture of contentment, peace, rest, enjoyment, provision, all of those aspects of the wife as a fruitful vine. And so I think it's much broader than just, is she having children? I think it's this idea of, is your wife a source of enjoyment, a source of peace, comfort? Is she productive? Even the physical character, the sweet smelling, beauty, those kinds of things mentioned as well. So that's what I think the author's getting across here. It's not just, hey, you're going to have lots of children through your wife. No, I don't think that's, if you look at the idea of a vine in the Old Testament, I don't think that's the picture that's focus. It's not just the fruit as a production of offspring. It's fruit as a source of enjoyment. It's the beauty of the vineyard. It's the place where they would go to receive, coolness and shade and the heat, a place of enjoyment, rest, those kinds of things. So that is the idea. The blessed man who fears the Lord, his wife in their home, she's a source of enjoyment, of rest, of peace, beauty, comfort. See the idea? So that's what we want to convey. If you're teaching this particular psalm, you want to convey that whole picture, because that, I believe, is what the author was communicating when he says your wife is like a fruitful vine. It's that whole set of things that could include children, but that's not the focus here. It's this idea of when you go into your home, your wife there, it's a place of rest, it's a place of comfort, of enjoyment, of blessing through your wife. Questions or thoughts about that?
Well, thank you, Pastor Tim, for bringing this up. I think it is so important that just in a very quick referencing way, looking at the idea of the fruitful vine, that what you are saying, or what I'm hearing, Pastor Tim, is that the original intent of the author may not be even about having many children. So when we modern day readers, we read the phrase fruitful vine, we actually injected our preconceived idea of fertility or having children into this psalm, where the author may not intended it to be. When you look at it, is a source of enjoyment, comfort, beauty, protection, peace, sustenance, and so on, as the way fruitful vine is used in the scriptures that you just referred to. I think it's a very good example of the caution not to do an eisegesis, but rather to do an exegesis.
Yeah.
And that can be very subtle, very unconscious kind of thing. We are unknowingly doing it to the scripture.
Yeah. I think that's very common, because a vine produces grapes. Oh, well, that must mean children. Well, it could mean, but how do we know? How do we find out? We go to, we have to understand that culture. And how do we understand that culture? We have to look at other passages. And what do they describe about a vine, a fruitful vine? So that takes some work, takes some effort. But
I'm just worried. Sorry.
Now go ahead.
I'm just jokingly thinking in my mind. I'm just worried that if our sisters in the church listen to this explanation, they say, "I'd rather be a man." Solve all my problem. I'd rather be a man.
Yeah.
Whenever I think of, of course, initially when we were discussing this a few weeks ago, we had the agrarian image of a vine. But now looking back and thinking further, I think Proverbs 31 actually provides a wonderful picture of a fruitful wife in that sense. She's somebody that, it mentions that it's a fruitful wine in the house, in your house. It's not in the field. So that caught my attention. It's a fruitful wine in the house. Of course, not only you're talking about children, but I think she's your anchor, and somebody you can depend on, and constant companion. You come home from work, for example, you see your wife. You see her busy getting things ready for you. She's a source of kindness, goodness to you, and so on. So it's not just bearing children. Of course, that's a portion of it, but she's also your best critic, your best critic. Although we men will not admit it, but I think your wife is the one who knows you most, the best and the most, and the deepest about you. The worst about you, and the worst about you, and yet the best about you.
Well, that's and that it's really the fruit production, the healthy vine that produces fruit. We have to be careful we don't make that fruit mean something that the original author didn't intend, as Yu Chai pointed out, even to import the idea of children there. Honestly, if you look at all those passages, we don't really we see it's much broader than that. So there are many childless women who are incredibly fruitful in this sense, who are a great blessing to their home, and really to others who enter that they're a source of peace and enjoyment, contentment, and blessing, even without kids. So we have to, like I said, take care, because imagine if you preach this psalm and you make children a focus when it's not at all what the original author's doing. You now have done what to the women in your congregation? You've right? You've placed a burden upon them that wasn't intended.
I think that's so true.
And, and they'll say, well, it says, that's what this passage is saying. Well, no, it's not what this passage is saying. But if it's presented that way, then there's this pressure like, okay. However, I would even in this psalm, I would turn it though, because I would say it's blessed is the man who fears the Lord. So I would have even, if a guy goes there with this psalm, I'd say, well, okay, the problem isn't your wife, it's you, buddy. You don't have kids because of you. Well, so, but that's not, children is not the focus here in this particular psalm, as far as having children. But, really the focus is on the man and the blessings in his home based on his faithfulness to the Lord. But
yeah.
So again, but the point here is just making sure we understand the image from the point of view of the author and the original audience. And how we find that is we have to be well read in the scripture. Even as Chai brought up, the Deuteronomy 28, that this idea would be embedded, would be ingrained in the Hebrew mindset of this, agricultural blessing for obedience and faithfulness. And so that these images would definitely be connected in their minds to that idea as well. And that only comes from, knowing the Old Testament. So we have to make sure we read our Bibles, the whole Bible, and then also, take advantage of, like Yuchai mentioned, the concordance, kind of look up other verses that mention. So that's all that I did here in this particular example. And then I did the same thing with the when it talks about your children are like olive plants. So what's the significance of the olive tree in that culture? All right. And so I looked up several passages there. It's an image of prosperity. It's described that way in Jeremiah 11, Psalm 52. And then, of course, we see the olive was very valuable in the ancient Near East for what it provided. The oil used for lamps, for anointing, for food. And there's other texts. I just have one example, but there are many other passages that support this. So the olive trees, right, the olive plants, what would that image encourage? It would convey to the original audience the idea of hope, future security, longevity, even right, prosperity.
Yeah, and you have there in Exodus 30, anointing.
Yeah. God's blessing in that sense as well. So there's a hope for your future. It's secure, prosperity, right? This idea of being conveyed. Again, God's blessing.
Yeah.
But that your family will live on beyond you and be prosperous. All right. Is the picture. That will be what this image conveyed. I also threw in a note there, studying olive trees. Olive trees can often take at least 10 years before they'll produce enough olives to, so there's kind of I don't know that the original author intended this idea, but when he mentions olive shoots, right, it doesn't say olive trees. He says olive shoots or plants. So it's like the little plant coming up from around the olive tree from the roots, right, to grow another olive tree. But it's not a mature tree yet. It's just the roots. So I think there might be a little bit there of just that those roots need to be cultivated, right? They need to be And same with a fruitful vine, right? A vine grower needs to take care of his vine and prune it and provide for it so that it will grow and be fruitful. So there is some of that the idea of the man and his role and responsibility in maintaining the fruitful vine, in growing the olive shoots into the tree.
Yeah.
Does it refer to parenting?
I think so.
Yeah.
And a
I think,
husband too.
yeah, I think those are, I believe, as I studied this passage, I believe those are reasonable applications to draw from this passage. And I think even the original author may have had some of that idea in mind, just understanding that the image there, again, the olive shoot, it doesn't mean just because our kids are smaller, so then the tree smaller. I think it's the idea of they're just starting out. They're just growing. And so there's hope in the future, but we have to cultivate, care for these olive shoots so that they achieve that maturity as well.
Yeah. I remember, Pastor Tim, you mentioned this in the church camp when we have the men's session, that you talk about the what is implied that the husband and the father is to cultivate the vine and the olive shoots, and it is. I'm not sure you say that, but the idea that I got was that it is our responsibility to actually disciple our wife and our children.
Yeah, I think there's a direct connection there. The man who fears the Lord, he's blessed in this way with the fruitful vine, with enjoying the labor of his hands, children. But that, I think in that culture, they understand those things don't just happen. They're provisions of the Lord, but it's through the efforts of the farmer. It's not a passive thing. Yeah, Daniel?
Sorry. It mentions also, I mean, you continue the sentence, it says, will be like olive shoots around your table. That's quite interesting. I mean, when we think of olive shoots, it should be at the base of a olive plant. But here, olive shoots, because the imagery there, olive shoots around your table. I mean, what do we do at the table? I mean, of course, immediately we think of feasting. So it's a time of coming together as a family. It's a time of sharing. So the table provides or rather the dinner, the feasting provides an opportunity to nurture our children, to talk of the things of the Lord, to bring them up in the fear of the Lord. I think that's probably also the idea, because when the Jewish family, when they come together, I think they sit down together and have a feast. It's not that the children eat first or the parents eat first, and then they have separate times for eating. But I think it's a coming together all at once. Let's sit down, let's have dinner, and during dinner let's talk, let's share, and so on and so forth. Do you think that would be kind of imagery?
Yeah, he clearly adds, right, the wife is a fruitful vine within your house, children like olive shoots around your table. So there's clearly an emphasis on the table was, where the family would gather at that time. And so he adds those phrases, I think, to emphasize that idea as well. So yeah.
Because
he
family
doesn't
coming together is also coming together, a sense of unity. That means the family has to be one, united as well. And that's how we bring them up in the fear of the Lord.
Yep. All right, good observation.
Sorry, talk too much.
No, that's great. Okay, so this is the idea. You want to spend a little time like examining the images presented in the poem. Again, you have like Psalm 23, right? Yahweh is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me, right, to still pastures, to quiet waters. So that's an image there. And what would be the significance of that image?
Mm.
The author, considering in that case it's David, who was a shepherd himself, and the original audience, how would they have understood that picture? So we want to make sure, you know, when you look at Hebrew poetry, that you are one, rightly identifying the image and its significance and understanding to the original audience. And sometimes that might take a little effort then to see, okay, how would they have understood what a shepherd is and this scene in their context, or in our case, the fruitful vine, olive shoots, you know, whatever that image is. So we want to identify those images and also their significance and importance to the original hearers. And we do that by have to explore other texts of scripture potentially to do that. Now here in this, and obviously the immediate context helps, and in this case, Psalm 128, this emphasis on blessing, that's obviously a focus here, that these images are meant to convey, to communicate blessing, blessing of God for the man who's faithful to him. All right. Final thoughts or questions on the imagery? Okay. Well, let's turn our attention to the figurative language used here. Now we want to look at poetic devices. And remember, we had really two kinds of poetic devices that we have. We have the figurative language, we're going to talk about in a minute, and then we have the other poetic devices. So we have, you can see on the screen there to the right, the different kinds of figures of speech, and we looked at this in some detail a little while back. Remember all these poetic terms that really describe the different kinds of figurative language. Because again, remember when you look at poetry, there are many poetic devices that the Hebrew poet will use. Some of those devices are figurative, meaning that the words he wrote are not to be taken literally. That is, you don't just take the definition of those words, that he didn't intend it the literal definition, but that it actually is meant to, has a different meaning than the dictionary definition of the word. And there are different kinds of figurative language, different kinds of figures of speech. So these are the kinds that maybe I'll do this first. You guys will remember these different ones. We had the comparisons, that is simile, metaphor, hypocatastasis, where one thing is being compared to another. We had examples of attributing features, that is like a human characteristic being described by a non-human object. When that human characteristic is describing something about God, then we call that an anthropomorphism. If it's an animal characteristic that's describing God, we call that a zoomorphism. We had substitution, where one thing will represent another, or something that's mentioned is actually that represents a whole. Euphemism was a word used in place of something like the sleep instead of death, or to know your wife instead of describing intimacy, use another term. An idiom is an expression, word or group of words that has a specific meaning, but it's not literal. We have hyperbole, the exaggeration, irony, The author intends to mean something different than what he actually says. Wordplay or puns, and then merism. So these are all examples of figurative language that is used to communicate particular principle. And so as we look at the psalm here, let's see, how do we do this?
What is walking? I mean, they aren't actually meaning under what category does it says here walking in his walks, in his ways? They aren't actually walking. It's something else. It's living. But what does that fall under?
Yeah, good question. That would be an idiom. It's an expression. It's not speaking of literal walking. Yeah, it's talking about how you live life. It's a very, very common one in all the Bible, Old and New Testament. We even use it today, walk the talk. But it's, I would say it's an idiom.
What about fear? That we actually aren't afraid of God. Sometimes we ought to be, and I think we are, but it means more than just fear, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's where you want to do a study of fear of the Lord in the Old Testament. Look at that expression. It's used quite often. And it can mean terror. And that's what it is. It means when you're not a Christian, not a believer, you experience terror before God. But for believers, for God's people, it's not that idea, but it conveys this idea of I like how Charles Bridges, a 19th century theologian, he describes it as an affectionate reverence. So there's the awe, the worship, the honor due to God, but also it's out of a relationship, not out of terror. So if you study that term in the Old Testament, you'll see this idea. I didn't have the other verses with me, but Deuteronomy 10 describes fear of the Lord as a serving God, loving God, obeying God. One psalm describes the fear of the Lord as trusting in God, being forgiven by God. So there's all these terms used to describe the fear of the Lord, really in the context of a relationship with God. That there's a reverence and a holy awe and honor, but it's not based on terror for God's child. It's based upon the relationship. Kind of like I use the illustration of, and this has happened to me. Someone pointed a gun at me, demanded money from me. And so, I'm looking for money to get, so I was going to obey him, not because, right, because I was afraid of him, what he's going to do, right? But if my father were to come and ask me for money, I would obey him, or I would give money to him, not because I was afraid of him, but because I love him and I want to honor him. So it can be the exact same action, right? Giving money to someone, but for two very different reasons. The guy with the gun, I do it because out of terror, I'm afraid. But my father, I would give him the money out of a respect and relationship. See the difference? So obviously with God, the respect and honor much, much higher than the earthly father. But I think it's that idea that we see as we look at various passages on fear of the Lord. Whereas the one who falls into the judgment of God, the fear of the Lord in that context would be terror. Like 1 John, when it says perfect love casts out fear. You know that verse? There in the
Yep.
context, the fear is described, it's the fear of punishment, because that's what he says in the very next line. So there, he's not talking about, maybe we can take a look at this. Might be a helpful way to illustrate, because I think it's a very important question that Dwayne brings up here. So if we go to 1 John 4, yeah, there is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear. Now, what kind of fear is he talking about here? Fear involves punishment. He's talking about that fear of that terror of receiving punishment. Notice verse 17, the context. Love has been perfected with us so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment. See, that we don't need to fear God's judgment because we are his child. And the perfect love he's speaking of here is God's love for us. All right? Cast out this kind of fear, this terror of judgment. Okay? So the fear being described here in this passage, as Dwayne pointed out, it's not that terror, because that's not what terror involves judgment. All right, it's this idea of reverence, of awe, of honor, of worship, respect, exalting, and doing that out of or based upon the relationship with him. Again, I could go to Deuteronomy 10 among several passages. I think it's verse 12. Yeah. So now, Israel, what does Yahweh your God ask me but to fear Yahweh, to walk in his ways? Notice that connection. We see that in Psalm 128. The obedience, the faithfulness. But notice what else he adds. Love him. Serve him with all your heart, with all your soul. Keep the commandments which I'm commanding you today for your good. Notice, behold, to Yahweh your God belong heaven, the highest heaven, the earth and all that is in it. Yet on your fathers did Yahweh set his affection to love them. And he chose their seed after them, even you above all peoples, as it is this day. Now notice here, as he's talking about fear of Yahweh, it's in the context of a relationship. And it involves obedience, faithfulness, serving God, loving him. All right. And we can go to other passages as well that conveys that idea. So again, that's another expression that we really need to make sure we understand rightly in this psalm. So I think Charles Bridges' definition is the best one I've found. An affectionate reverence by which the child of God humbly bows his knee in obedience. All right, so there's this response of obedience and service to God based upon an affectionate reverence for God. And that only comes through relationship. So it's not the fear in terms of the terror. That's for those who don't know God. It's more the idea of this affectionate reverence that produces obedience and faithfulness to God. And that's what we see in the psalm. How blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. So that's describing, what does the fear of the Lord look like? Someone who's faithful to God and obedience. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, I'll have to. I think I mentioned that in the that quote in when I taught this psalm in Malaysia. But again, I think because it's repeated here, right? This fearing the Lord, it's obviously a key theme. We really want to make sure we explain that. Blesses everyone who fears the Lord. And then again, who fears the Lord. So the basis of the blessing is upon the one fearing the Lord. We want to make sure that we explain that correctly to whenever we teach this passage. What does this fear of the Lord mean? What is he talking about here? This is obviously a key part of this psalm. If we don't understand what that means, then we can't help people to know. How blessed is everyone who fears the Lord? Well, what does it mean to fear the Lord? I need to know that if I want to experience God's blessing. So this would be a key concept you would want to teach. Make sure that your hearers understand what that means. So again, that would be, going to some Old Testament passages like Deuteronomy 10 and showing what is involved in this fear of the Lord. Because that term in English, fear, we have automatically this idea of I'm scared, I'm afraid. All right. And certainly there's that element, like when you see the Apostle John, right? When Jesus appears to him in Revelation chapter 1, you remember what John did?
He was like a dead man.
Yeah, he fainted. Like, right? It's like, so there is that element of fear, being afraid, just because of the awesomeness of God. But even remember, what did Jesus tell John? He said, get up, don't be afraid. So there's that relationship part that, Jesus emphasizes there. But certainly, yes, the whole awesomeness and power and majesty of God is going to produce a trepidation, a nervousness, a fear, but it's not the same kind of experience that someone who is an unbeliever will have. So we just want to make sure we explain that with this when you're going through this psalm. But yeah, I think it's the most important question to have for this psalm. I think Dwayne is correct in identifying this as a key statement we want to understand. Okay. And again, it's going to take effort and study of, okay, how this expression and how is it used in the Old Testament. And again, a concordance could be very helpful in this. It's used in both ways. It's used as a terror, right? When God pours out judgment, but it's also used to express the commitment of God's people in walking in obedience and service and love and faith in him based upon that relationship with him. Comments, questions, thoughts? Well, I think given the time, probably be best to pause here because I wanted to, we're going to need to remind ourselves of these figures of speech and then apply them to the psalm here. So maybe it'd be best this week if you could go back and sort of review these. Maybe I'll send you guys a previous lesson when we covered that. So just review them a little bit so that when we gather next time, we can more easily identify in this psalm which devices are used. And remember, there's the figures of speech and also the other poetic devices, the refrain, the repetition, interjection, these as well. So we want to understand those also. So I'll send you a few notes just to review. And then next week, we'll go through the psalm and identify those poetic devices together and what their significance is for understanding the psalm. Because again, we want to note those devices not just as an academic exercise. No, I found a metaphor. Well, it's what's the intent behind that device? How does that help us better understand what the poet is expressing in the poem? So let's break it here just so we can give a more complete treatment of these next time we gather next week. Okay?
Right.
All right. Thoughts or questions or anything before we end for the evening?
Yeah, it would be good to have a list of these things if we could download it and put it into the notebook, because these things are all over the place. The Bible has got so much figurative language.
Yes.
Good. Work that into our thinking.
Yeah, we see it not just in Hebrew poetry, but Jesus used a lot of figures of speech. We see it in Paul, even the epistles. So and this is one of the reasons I've been spending some time on looking at Hebrew poetry, is it's not just in the Psalms. It's really, in several Old Testament books, right? Job and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, many of the prophets used Hebrew poetry. We see it all through Isaiah, see it all through Hosea and Joel, these guys, but also we see many examples of it used in the New Testament. Even a famous passage in John 10, Jesus says, "I'm the good shepherd." He describes himself there as a door. I'm the door. I'm the good shepherd. Jesus used several figures of speech to describe himself. I'm the living water. I'm the bread of life. Right? So these are John 6, right? We talked about this before. Eat my flesh, drink my blood. Did Jesus mean that literally, or was that a figure of speech? Right? That's a significant doctrinal. We need to understand that there, because if you don't recognize that's a figure of speech, right, that's a significant doctrinal, affects our doctrine significantly, right? Catholic Church has a whole false understanding of communion based upon taking that literally. So sometimes if we don't see the figure of speech, we can do great damage to the people by misinterpreting. Or other times where something was actually meant to be literal, but it was assumed to be figurative.
Yeah.
So this idea of understanding figures of speech, figurative language, is important, not just in looking at the Psalms, but really and even Paul. There's many examples. He was obviously, as a Jewish scholar, and as well, he uses poetic devices quite often in his writing. So being able to see them and recognize them is very important. So yeah, I'll send you the notes where we covered that, just so you can review them as well, and that'll help us next week. All right. Well, Fue, would you mind closing our time in prayer? It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Soti. All right, sir. Then let me in our pray in today. Okay, let's pray.